Welcome back, Revolution students, to another video on the Chinese Revolution, Area of Study 2. In this video, I'm going to look at the early mass campaigns, or start looking at them, and in particular, the thought reform campaign. The videos I'm going to make after this one are going to look at the other early mass campaigns, such as the San Fan, the Wu Fan, and Fan Shen, which was associated with the agrarian reform law. But we'll get to those in the future. So anyway, today we're looking at the Thought Reform Campaign. And the Thought Reform Campaign started, you can see there, in September 1951. And its big focus was looking at or targeted intellectuals. So in particular, you can see there university professors, teachers, writers, and other educated people to rid them of their bourgeois attitudes. The CCP leadership understood that they needed to retain the support of these people because they wanted to create a modern economy. And in order to have a modern economy, you needed educated workers. And to have educated workers, you needed a strong education system. So the CCP wanted to retain the support of these intellectuals. However, they also wanted to make sure that they had the right attitude towards the CCP and socialism. And the aim of the Thought Reform Campaign was to achieve that. So, many of the techniques that were used on these intellectuals to reshape their attitudes, to reshape their thoughts, to make them fervent supporters of the CCP and a new communist China, were based upon those techniques that were first practiced at Yan'an during and you can see there, the Thought Rectification Campaign. And I looked at that in one of my previous videos on China AOS 1. And the Thought Rectification Campaign, you can see there, it ran for a good 4 years. One of the big consequences of that was it enabled Mao Zedong to establish his leadership within the CCP. The techniques though that we used during the Thought Rectification Campaign and during this Thought Reform Campaign, which started in September 1951, are listed there. So, intellectuals, if they were deemed as having a bourgeois attitude, if they had written something that was supportive of capitalism, or they had written something about the United States, for example, and said the United States is awesome, then they were deemed as needing rectification or reform, and this is what they were forced to do. So they were forced to read Marxist texts a lot. They had to make self-criticisms and admit to incorrect thoughts. They had to write self-biographies and continually revise them until all bourgeois habits were admitted. If you've had a chance to watch The Last Emperor, the movie, and there's a number of scenes where Puyi, when he's put in prison after the fall of Manchukuo, the Japanese are defeated and the CCP get Puyi and they put him in prison, he has to actually undertake a number of these practices. So he goes through lots and lots of struggle sessions. There's scenes where he's written his biography and then he has to rewrite it because it is deemed by his prison wardens as not being sufficiently accurate. So let's move on. So apart from that, intellectuals are also forced to give public denunciations of their ideological shortcomings. So these intellectuals would have to stand up in front of students, other intellectuals, and admit what's wrong with their thinking. They had to attend struggle sessions where they were forced to report their progress in front of communist cadres, as well as their peers and groups of workers and students, as I just said. And if after doing all of these things, if the authorities of the CCP felt that these intellectuals still harboured capitalist attitudes, if they were still bourgeois, or if they refused to recant and admit that they were wrong, then they were sent off to be remoulded through education in labour camps, these Laogai. And we're going to learn a lot about Laogai in the coming videos. So lots of people were sent to Laogai both during this thought reform campaign, the later mass campaigns, the San Fan, the Wu Fan, going into the 100 Flowers, and then we're going right out to when we get into the Cultural Revolution. People were sent to these Laogai if they were deemed by the regime as being reactionaries or bad elements. And many people died in these labour camps, and we'll get some stats on those as well later. Okay, so a consequence of the thought reform campaign was that intellectuals and others in China learned not to criticise the CCP or Mao Zedong. And here's the big thing here. So this lack of criticism contributed to the tragedies of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. When we get to the Great Leap Forward, we're going to see that there were opportunities for people in positions of power, for experts in farming and so forth, to criticise the practices that were being undertaken during the Great Leap Forward, to put a stop to them, and therefore try to, and then by stopping the bad practices, stop the actual famine that did occur. But these people didn't speak out. We'll see there was one leader, Peng Duhui, who did stand up to Mao Zedong, but then he was pretty much shouted down by everybody, and the policies kept going, and millions of people died during the Great Leap Forward as a consequence. So, and all of this, this fear of criticising the regime comes back to this here now, this thought reform campaign, and the other mass campaigns where critics were crushed. All right, so that's our summary of the thought reform campaign. Okay, let's have a look at our historical interpretations now. So I've got two here. The first one is from Frank Dakota, and the second one is from Philip Short. So we'll look at Frank Dakota first, and it's a very short one. And he writes, thought reform was a carefully cultivated Auschwitz of the mind. And I've taken that quote straight from Tom Ryan, who cited it in his work, China Rising. And it's a nice quote because it's an easy one to remember, a carefully cultivated Auschwitz of the mind. A nice historical interpretation which you can just slip into your answers in the exam. The second historical interpretation for the thought reform campaigns I've taken, as I just said, from Philip Short. And he writes, and a thought reform movement modelled on the Yan'an rectification campaign designed to remould urban intellectuals, especially those trained in the West, so as to enforce conformity and eradicate bourgeois ideas. Again, the primary actors were not the state or party agencies, but the men and women who were themselves the targets of each campaign and the broad masses mobilised to judge them. So we need to understand in all these thought reform campaigns, the San Fan, the Wu Fan, when we get to the 100 Flowers as well. As a Chinese person at this time, you pretty much had two options. You either attacked reactionaries or people who were perceived as having a bourgeois attitude and needed to be struggled against, or you yourself became suspect and you would be attacked. So the options were few, and as a consequence you had to participate in these campaigns. Intellectuals were treated differently from the bourgeoisie. They were to be cleansed of bourgeois ideology, especially individualism, pro-Americanism, objectivism, indifference to politics, and contempt for the toiling masses, and the toiling masses being the peasants and the workers, peasants in particular. These issues were discussed in small groups whose participants would make repeated self-criticisms until, and here's the nice quote here, layer after layer, anything resembling independent thought, incompatible with Maoist orthodoxy, had been stripped away. And that's just shows you that sense of the individual gets lost in the group, in the socialist state. So your role as an individual is to support the socialist state. So anyway, that's a nice historical interpretation, second historical interpretation for the thought reform campaign. I hope you have found this video useful for your study of China Area of Study 2, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.